Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and I have a chemistry demonstration to share with you today. We're using this book called Chemistry the Waldorf Way, and we are working on the demonstration of chemical changes, release of heat. So for this demonstration, we need lye or sodium hydroxide, and so this is a chemical that needs a lot of care in its use, and so we do have our goggles and we also have some gloves as well. We're going to be adding the sodium hydroxide to water. You never want to add water to sodium hydroxide. So that's the first bit of really important safety measures that we need to be mindful of. And then of course we have our other safety goggles and other things in order to stay safe during this demonstration. So we are going to be measuring a release of energy, and that's going to be in the form of heat. And for this, because we're using just a very small amount, you can actually just hold the beaker and feel that release of heat. I also do have a thermometer, and I also have a thermometer that you can just point at the liquid. So I think we'll start with that first, and then we can measure in other ways as well. So the first thing we're going to do is get our safety gear on, and then we're going to measure out the materials that we need. We're going to start with 3 grams of lye in 30 milliliters of water. So I'm going to measure that out, and then we'll measure out the lye. Okay, let's begin with 30 mils of water. Okay, we're going to do this in grams. Oh yeah, you can feel that warm even through the gloves. Let's check the temperature. That was a significant increase. And then it's hot where you would not be able to hold your fingers under there for too long. Well, that's brilliant. Yeah, what a great demonstration to show the release of heat through a chemical reaction. Okay, so now it's been a couple of minutes, and the temperature, oh, it shows 104. It does not feel like, feels like it was hotter right when we did it. It's time to dispose of our solution. We're going to dilute it with water before you can safely put it down the drain. However, it is still highly caustic, so do be careful. Now that our demonstration is complete, it's time to write this up in the main lesson book. I'm using main lesson books from A Child's Dream. These measure 9.5 inches by 12 inches. They have blank pages separated by an onion skin. I'm titling this Exothermic Reactions, and I'm going to write this up like a lab report. Now you can also use a lab book in order to do this, but we're going to go ahead and put this into our main lesson book. We've only done a couple of lab reports for our chemistry demonstrations. We don't do them for every demonstration, but for this one and the one that follows, we are going to do a lab report. So I'm going to write this up in the main lesson book with the typical things that you would find in a lab report, with a title, the objective, procedures, materials, observations, and a conclusion. Now, we have done our demonstration 3 times over the course of 3 days before we wrote up our lab report. On the final day of doing our demonstration is when we wrote up the lab report. So we had a couple of days to process the demonstration, to talk about what was happening before we actually wrote up the lab report. When we did this, I wrote up one lab report first, and then my daughter, who is 14, took this lab report, followed the procedures, and did the demonstration again on her own. The first day I did the demonstration was to make sure that the demonstration actually worked well. The second day we did the demonstration was one in which I did the demonstration for her so she could observe it. And on the third day is the day that she did the demonstration on her own. On the third day when she did the demonstration, she followed the procedures that I had written down. When it came time for her to write this up into her main lesson book, she needed to write her own procedures, materials, and her observations on her own. Additionally, we included a chart to show the amount of sodium hydroxide we used and the initial temperature and final temperature of the water, including the difference in temperature. We potentially can add varying amounts of sodium hydroxide to water to see if there is a difference in the temperature release depending on the amounts of both of these substances. But as this was a demonstration rather than an experiment, we decided to forego that part. I'm adding a little illustration here. It's optional. I don't think that an illustration is necessary for a lab report, but as we still had some space in our main lesson book, I decided to include an illustration. We are working on the onion skin of this 2-page spread. It's not typical to be using the onion skin for your illustrations or for your written work in a main lesson book, but we tend to use it pretty often. Sometimes we'll use it to trace illustrations. Other times we use it for an illustration. And in this case, we're using it for both illustration and the remainder of our lab report. So I'm just adding in the process of what is going on here as we are adding our sodium hydroxide to the water. Additionally, I wanted to add a note about what is actually going on with this chemical reaction, because in fact, it's more of an exothermic reaction rather than a true chemical reaction. And so I wanted to explain a little bit further on those details for this part of the demonstration. So our conclusion also includes the written portion that I would otherwise keep separate from the lab report. When my daughter included this into her main lesson book, she did it in the main lesson book as a lab report. When we did our next lab report, we decided to use a lab book just so that she can get the experience of using a lab book and what that entails if you were in a lab. The primary purpose of doing these demonstrations is to experience the chemistry phenomena. So this is what the lab report looks like when it's done, with both a little bit of an illustration as well as our lab report, including a little bit more about the phenomena that we experienced. I hope that you enjoyed this look at our chemistry demonstration. Don't forget to check out the blog post that accompanies this video for more information and video tutorials. You can find the link to that blog post in the description box below. And if you'd like to see how we're homeschooling on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram and now on TikTok at Pepper and Pine.